The discovery came on a wet October morning in 1978, when a retired schoolteacher named Martha Pender decided to clear the overgrown family plot in the old Hanging Dog Cemetery, deep in the Cherokee County hills of western North Carolina. The cemetery itself was a forgotten thing, a few tilting headstones half swallowed by kudzu, a rusted iron fence that had long since surrendered to the forest. Martha had come to lay flowers on her grandmother's grave, a simple act of remembrance that would instead unravel a century of silence. She found it wedged between the roots of an ancient oak that had grown through the cemetery's northern boundary, a small, water-stained ledger wrapped in oilcloth, the leather cover gnawed by time and animals. Inside, in fading ink, was a record of burials that had never been entered into any county register. Names she had never heard. Dates that made no sense. And in the margins, written in a hand that grew increasingly unsteady, a single recurring notation: hanging dog, punished, no marker. There were 27 names in that ledger. 27 souls buried in unmarked graves, their deaths recorded with the clinical detachment of a man who had seen too much and wanted to forget. Martha Pender had stumbled upon something the mountains had been trying to hide for more than a century, a secret that would lead her through the tangled history of the Cherokee Nation, the broken treaties of the Trail of Tears, and into the heart of a forgotten war that never made it into the history books. The Hanging Dog community sits in the far western reaches of North Carolina, nestled in the folds of the Unicoi Mountains, where the Cherokee County line meets the Tennessee border. Today it is quiet farmland and forest, winding gravel roads, and the occasional trailer or clapboard house. But in the decades before the Civil War, Hanging Dog was one of the most contested pieces of ground in the American South. The name itself is a relic of another time. Hanging Dog is an anglicized corruption of a Cherokee place name *Gowanahiu*, roughly translating to the place where the hounds were hanged. According to Cherokee oral tradition, the name commemorates a hunting party that returned to find their dogs had been killed by a rival tribe, their bodies left hanging from the trees as a warning. But the land had been sacred to the Cherokee long before any Europeans set foot in the valley. It was hunting ground, burial ground, and the heart of a vast territory that had been Cherokee since before memory began. The arrival of white settlers in the 1820s and 1830s changed everything. The discovery of gold in nearby Dahlonega, Georgia, in 1828 set off a frenzy that would eventually consume the entire Cherokee Nation. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson, gave the federal government the legal authority to negotiate removal treaties with Native American tribes east of the Mississippi. In practice, it was a mandate for ethnic cleansing. The Cherokee fought through the courts, and in 1832, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Worcester v. Georgia that the Cherokee Nation was a sovereign entity and that Georgia's laws had no force within its borders. President Jackson reportedly responded, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." The ruling was ignored. The removal went forward. By 1838, the federal government had rounded up more than 16,000 Cherokee and forced them into stockades, where they were held in squalid conditions before being marched west along the Trail of Tears. An estimated 4,000 Cherokee died on that journey, roughly 1 in 4. The survivors were relocated to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma, and the Cherokee Nation's ancestral lands were open to white settlement. But not all the Cherokee went west. An unknown number, perhaps several hundred, perhaps several thousand, escaped the Roundups and fled into the remote mountain fastnesses of North Carolina and Tennessee. They hid in caves, lived in the deepest hollows, and survived through a combination of stealth, luck, and the quiet assistance of sympathetic white neighbors. These were the Cherokee who would come to be known as the Oconaluftee, the people of the river who had refused to leave. The federal government knew they were there. But the mountains were vast, the resources for pursuing them limited, and there was a sense, unofficial, unspoken, that the matter was settled. The Cherokee were gone. Those who remained were too few to matter. For a time, that was true. The Hanging Dog Valley became a refuge for the escaped Cherokee and a flashpoint for the tensions that would eventually explode into the Civil War. The valley was remote, difficult to access, and controlled by a handful of white families who had settled there before removal, families who, for reasons of conscience or convenience, had chosen to look the other way when their Cherokee neighbors fled into the hills. One of those families was the Penders. According to Martha Pender's research, pieced together from fragmentary family letters, church records, and the testimony of elderly relatives, the Penders had arrived in the Hanging Dog Valley in 1835, just before the removal began. They were farmers, subsistence level, scratching a living out of the thin mountain soil. They had no particular love for the Cherokee, but they also had no particular hatred. They were simply trying to survive. That changed in 1837, when a young Cherokee woman named Siahi appeared at their cabin door, a child in her arms, fleeing the Roundup soldiers who were scouring the valley. The Penders took her in. It was an act of mercy that would have consequences they could never have imagined. Siahi stayed. She helped with the farm, taught the Penders' children how to find medicinal herbs in the forest, and eventually married one of the Pender sons, a man named Elijah Pender, who had been too poor and too isolated to find a white wife. The marriage was not legal under North Carolina law, but in the mountains, legal was a flexible concept. By 1850, the Hanging Dog Valley had become a strange hybrid community. White farmers, escaped Cherokee, and the mixed-race children of their unions lived side by side in a fragile equilibrium. They traded with each other, intermarried, and shared the hardships of frontier life. The outside world, with its laws and its prejudices, was a distant and mostly irrelevant concern. But the outside world was not content to leave them alone. The discovery of the burial ledger opened a door into a world that Martha Pender had never known existed. But it was the discovery of a second document, 6 months later, that would turn a family mystery into a historical reckoning. In the spring of 1979, Martha received a letter from a distant cousin in Tennessee, a man named Calvin Pender, who had been clearing out his own family attic and had found a bundle of old letters tied with ribbon. The letters, dated between 1861 and 1865, were written by a Civil War soldier named Nathaniel Pender, a young man who had joined the Confederate Army in the early days of the war and had died in a prisoner of war camp in 1864. Nathaniel's letters were filled with the usual soldiers' complaints: lack of food, lack of pay, the misery of camp life, but they also contained something far more disturbing. Over and over, Nathaniel returned to a single theme: the fate of the Cherokee families who had remained in the Hanging Dog Valley. He described strange doings in the mountains and secret orders from Richmond. He spoke of hunting parties that were not hunting game, and of punishments that were being meted out to those who would not leave. The letters were vague, written in a code that seemed designed to confuse any censor who might read them. But as Martha pored over them, a picture began to emerge, a picture of a secret war being fought alongside the great conflict between North and South. Nathaniel Pender was not a reliable narrator. He was a young man, far from home, desperate for news and eager to impress his family with his inside knowledge. But his letters corroborated the burial ledger in ways that could not be coincidental. The names in the ledger, Cherokee names, mostly, with a few white families mixed in, matched the names in Nathaniel's letters. And the dates, 1863 and 1864, matched as well. Something terrible had happened in the Hanging Dog Valley during the Civil War. Something that had been deliberately erased from the historical record. To understand what happened in Hanging Dog, you have to understand what was happening in the wider world. The Civil War was never simply a conflict between North and South. It was a war within a war, a struggle for control of the American continent that had been raging for decades before Fort Sumter. And in the mountains of western North Carolina, the lines of loyalty were tangled beyond belief. The Cherokee who had remained in the region after removal were caught in a nightmare of competing pressures. The Confederacy, desperate for manpower and eager to establish control over the border regions, began courting Native American tribes in 1861. The Cherokee Nation, based in Indian Territory, had signed a treaty with the Confederacy that summer, agreeing to supply troops in exchange for protection. But the Eastern Cherokee, those who had stayed behind, were not part of that treaty. They were, in the eyes of the law, simply squatters on land that the federal government had already claimed. The Confederacy saw them as a potential asset, a source of guides, scouts, and occasional soldiers. But they were also seen as a potential liability, a reminder that the South's vision of a white man's republic was never truly achievable. The Confederacy's official policy toward Native Americans was one of pragmatic exploitation: use them when useful, discard them when they became inconvenient. In the mountain counties of western North Carolina, the policy was far more brutal. Local Confederate authorities, many of them drawn from the same families who had agitated for removal in the 1830s, saw the Cherokee as a problem to be solved. They were occupying land that white families wanted. They were intermarrying with white families, blurring the lines of race that were central to the Confederate project. They were, in the words of one local official, a stain upon the community and an obstacle to progress. The solution was simple: remove them. Again. By the spring of 1863, a coordinated campaign was underway. Local militia units, operating under the authority of the Confederate government in Richmond, began rounding up the Cherokee families in the Hanging Dog Valley and surrounding areas. The official rationale was that these families were potential spies for the Union, a convenient charge that was almost entirely false. The real reason was land and money. But something went wrong. The burial ledger tells the story in cryptic, abbreviated entries. Asterisk May 1863, 2 families taken. No marker, asterisk. Asterisk July 1863, the widow and her children. Punished. No marker, asterisk. Asterisk October 1863, Elijah and all his household. No marker. Hanging Dog, asterisk. The entries are chilling in their brevity. There are no details about how these people died, only the cold notation that they had been punished. The name Hanging Dog appears again and again, sometimes as a location, sometimes as a verb. It is impossible to tell whether the writer is referring to the valley or to the act of hanging. Martha Pender spent years trying to identify the people named in the ledger. She combed through census records, land deeds, church registries, and the scattered remains of family Bibles. She interviewed the oldest residents of Cherokee County, many of whom were descendants of the original white settlers. She drove hundreds of miles to visit courthouses and archives, searching for any scrap of evidence that would confirm what the ledger seemed to indicate. The picture that emerged was fragmentary but devastating. Between 1863 and 1865, at least 30 Cherokee families were forcibly removed from the Hanging Dog Valley, not to Indian Territory, but to the Confederate prison camp at Andersonville, Georgia, or to one of the smaller prison facilities that dotted the southern landscape. These were not prisoners of war in any meaningful sense. They were civilians, rounded up on suspicion of disloyalty, their property confiscated and their families broken. The journey to Andersonville was a death march. The prisoners, men, women, and children, were marched through the mountains in the dead of winter, denied adequate food or clothing, and subjected to beatings and humiliation along the way. The Confederate guards who escorted them had been given explicit instructions: those who could not keep up would be shot. Some of the Cherokees survived the journey. They arrived at Andersonville, already sick and starved, and were thrown into the general population of prisoners, where they died of disease or neglect. Others were transferred to smaller prisons or used as forced labor on Confederate fortifications. But the majority never made it to Andersonville at all. They died on the trail of exposure, of starvation, of the wounds inflicted by their captors. Their bodies were left in shallow graves, or not buried at all, their final resting places lost to the mountain wilderness. And then there were those who never even left the valley. The ledger contains several entries that Martha could not explain, until she began to understand that punished was a word that covered a multitude of sins. Some of the Cherokee families who refused to be rounded up were simply killed on the spot. Others were hanged from the same trees that had given Hanging Dog its name, as a warning to the rest. The writer of the ledger, Martha eventually discovered, was a local justice of the peace named Uriah Pender, her great-great-grandfather. He was a man who had always been considered a pillar of the community, a devout churchgoer, and a respected citizen. He had also, it seemed, been the recorder of a massacre. Martha's discovery of Uriah's ledger forced her to confront the possibility that her own family had been complicit in a crime that had never been acknowledged, never investigated, and never punished. The burial ledger was not a confession. Uriah had been too careful for that. But it was, at the very least, an accounting. A private record of the dead, kept for the sake of his own conscience, hidden away where no one would ever find it. The secret of Hanging Dog was not unique. Similar stories existed in dozens of mountain communities across the South. The Civil War had provided cover for a wave of ethnic cleansing, the final chapter of a long and bloody history of dispossession that had begun when the first Europeans set foot on American shores. But Hanging Dog was different. The scale of the deaths was smaller, perhaps 30 families, perhaps 40, but the secrecy was more complete. The federal government had no interest in pursuing the matter. The war had ended, and there was a nation to rebuild. The Confederate government had collapsed, and its records were in chaos. The Cherokee had been scattered, their oral traditions shattered by decades of displacement and loss. The only record of what had happened was in Uriah Pender's ledger, hidden beneath the roots of an oak tree in a forgotten cemetery. Martha Pender spent the rest of her life trying to uncover the truth. She wrote letters to historians, to Native American advocacy groups, to the National Park Service and the Smithsonian Institution. She gave interviews to local newspapers and was interviewed by researchers from several universities. She published a short book privately printed, only 100 copies, that laid out her findings and pleaded for a full investigation. She was met, for the most part, with silence. The historians who read her work dismissed it as the ramblings of an amateur. The Cherokee representatives who might have been interested were already overwhelmed with other, larger grievances. The federal agencies that might have been able to help had no authority and no budget. But Martha Pender's work did not go entirely unnoticed. In the mid-1980s, a researcher from the University of North Carolina named Dr. Sarah Cheney began looking into the Hanging Dog story. Dr. Cheney was a specialist in post-Civil War Southern history, with a particular interest in the treatment of Native Americans during the Reconstruction era. She had come across Martha's book in a used bookstore in Asheville and had been immediately struck by its implications. Dr. Cheney had access to resources that Martha Pender could only dream of: university archives, government records, and a network of colleagues who could help her piece together the historical puzzle. Over the next decade, she conducted a systematic investigation of the Hanging Dog atrocities, using Uriah Pender's ledger as her starting point. What she found was extraordinary. The Confederate military records from the period were, as Martha had discovered, almost entirely destroyed or scattered. But Dr. Cheney discovered a cache of documents in the National Archives that had never been properly cataloged: letters, reports, and orders from the Confederate command in western North Carolina that had been filed under a generic heading and forgotten for more than a century. These documents painted a picture of a campaign that had been carefully planned and ruthlessly executed. In early 1863, a Confederate officer named Colonel William H. Thomas had been given command of the so-called Cherokee Battalion, a unit that had been recruited from the Cherokee who had remained in the region. Colonel Thomas was a controversial figure, a white man who had been adopted by the Cherokee as a child, who spoke their language fluently, and who had been given the rank of colonel specifically to lead Native American troops. But Colonel Thomas's loyalty was to the Confederacy, not to the Cherokee. Under his orders, the Cherokee Battalion was used to round up Cherokee families who had refused to join the Confederate cause. They were used to capture and imprison their own people. The documents Dr. Cheney uncovered included a series of orders from Colonel Thomas to the commander of the prison camp at Andersonville, requesting the transfer of a number of Indian prisoners from the Hanging Dog area. The orders were chillingly matter-of-fact: please make provision for the encampment of 40 to 50 families, to be received within the week. There was no mention of their condition, no concern for their welfare, only the cold accounting of prisoners being moved from one location to another. But Dr. Cheney also found evidence that Colonel Thomas's campaign had been illegal, not just immoral, but illegal under Confederate law. The prisoners taken from Hanging Dog were civilians, not soldiers. They had not been charged with any crime. They had not been tried by any court. They had simply been swept up and transported to a death camp, their property confiscated, their families destroyed. The Confederate government had recognized this problem. In 1864, a military tribunal in Richmond had quietly ordered Colonel Thomas to release the remaining Cherokee prisoners and return them to their homes. The order was never fully carried out. The war was ending, the Confederate government was collapsing, and the prisoners had already been lost. Dr. Cheney's investigation also uncovered a web of cover-up and complicity that extended far beyond the mountains of western North Carolina. After the war, the federal government sent agents to the region to investigate reports of violence against Native Americans. These agents were supposed to document the crimes and recommend prosecution. Instead, they were met with a wall of silence. Local officials refused to cooperate. Witnesses refused to come forward. The Cherokee themselves, traumatized and scattered, were unable or unwilling to testify. One of the federal agents, a man named John W. H. Smith, was so frustrated by the obstruction that he filed a formal complaint with his superiors. "These people know what happened," he wrote. "They will not speak. The mountains are full of secrets, and they will take them to their graves." Smith's complaint was buried. No investigation was ever launched. The Hanging Dog Massacre, as it would later come to be called, was simply forgotten. Dr. Cheney's research suggested that the cover-up was coordinated at the highest levels. The local white families who had benefited from the confiscation of Cherokee land had formed a kind of mutual defense pact, protecting each other from prosecution and maintaining a code of silence that lasted for generations. Uriah Pender's burial ledger was a private record, kept in secret, shared with no one. The public record was clean. When Dr. Cheney published her findings in 1995, the response was immediate and hostile. Local historians accused her of sensationalizing the past and defaming the memory of honorable men. The descendants of the white families who had been involved in the Roundups refused to speak to her. The Cherokee themselves, who had finally begun to organize and assert their rights in the 1980s and 1990s, were initially skeptical of her work, viewing it as another example of white scholars exploiting their history for professional advancement. But slowly, as Dr. Cheney's evidence mounted, the truth began to emerge. Additional burial ledgers were discovered in family attics across the region. Oral traditions, previously dismissed as folklore, were found to correlate with the written records. The story of Hanging Dog became part of the larger story of the Trail of Tears, the Civil War, and the unfinished work of American justice. In the year 2000, a small group of Cherokee descendants, white family members, and historians gathered at the Hanging Dog Cemetery to dedicate a memorial to the victims of the massacre. The memorial was simple: a rough-hewn stone, inscribed with the names of the dead that Martha Pender had found in Uriah's ledger, along with the words, "Remember the Forgotten." The ceremony was emotional. The descendants of the victims, many of whom had grown up with a vague sense of loss that they could not articulate, finally had a place to mourn. The descendants of the perpetrators, many of whom had lived their entire lives with a family secret that they could not speak, were given an opportunity to make amends. But the truth of Hanging Dog, as Martha Pender had discovered decades earlier, was far from simple. The families who had been taken from the valley, the Cherokee, the intermarried whites, the mixed-race children, had not all died. Some had survived, and they had built new lives in Indian territory. The children who were removed during the Civil War grew up among their own people, but the loss of their homeland was never fully healed. And the land itself had not forgotten. Even today, people who live near the Hanging Dog Valley speak of strange sights and sounds. Ghost lights are said to dance in the meadows on certain nights. The sound of weeping can be heard in the hollows. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, the wind seems to carry the names of the dead. Whether these are real phenomena or just the residue of a traumatic history is impossible to say. The human mind is capable of extraordinary feats of suggestion, and the power of a place like Hanging Dog to shape perception is immense. But the stories persist, and they are told with a conviction that makes them hard to dismiss. Martha Pender passed away in 2003, having spent more than 25 years uncovering the secret of hanging dog. She never received the recognition she deserved. Her work was never officially acknowledged by any government or university. But her legacy lives on in the memorial she inspired, and in the hearts of those who remember. The final entry in Uriah Pender's ledger is dated October 1865, just after the end of the Civil War. It is not a burial record. It is a single line, written in the same careful hand as the entries that preceded it, but with a finality that suggests the end of something, the end of a story that had been unfolding for more than 2 years. It reads, no more. God help us all. Uriah Pender lived for another 20 years after the war. He served as a justice of the peace, raised a family, and died in his bed, a respected citizen of the community. He took the secret of hanging dog with him to his grave, or so he thought. The ledger he had hidden in the cemetery wall was his confession, his reckoning, his attempt to make amends in the only way he knew how. But the ledger also raises a question that has never been fully answered: what else did Uriah Pender know? The Civil War was a time of chaos, of competing loyalties, of brutality that was never recorded. The hanging dog massacre was just one of many such atrocities. Are there other ledgers? Other caches of documents? Other secrets waiting to be found? The mountains of western North Carolina have a way of keeping their secrets. The soil is deep, the forests are thick, and the cemeteries are scattered and poorly marked. There are countless unmarked graves, countless forgotten stories. The hanging dog ledger was found by accident, a chance discovery that might never have been made if Martha Pender had not decided to clear the family plot. What else is hidden beneath the roots of the old oaks? What other stories are waiting to be told? The answer, for now, is unknown. The history of hanging dog, the Cherokee Nation, and the Civil War continues to be written and rewritten, as new documents are discovered and new perspectives are brought to bear. But the truth of what happened in the valley, the human cost of a world that was dying and a world that was being born, will never be fully captured in any record. Some secrets are too heavy for paper. Some silence is the only answer.